Okay, awesome. Okay, just a couple more people here. All right, well, welcome everyone. We are so excited, Dean and I, to be co-hosting this event tonight. And we titled it Mindfulness. Oh, let me see if I've got a, okay. See if I can mute this. All right, let me see if I'm going to do this right. All right, sorry about that, guys. I haven't streamed to YouTube before. All right, let me see. Okay, I think it's still going. All right, so anyway, our topic tonight is mindfulness and learning how to have a learning to do mindfulness in light of everything going on in the world. Dean and I were really talking about how could we serve our community better here in Charleston and at large. And we really wanted to speak to how people could help themselves in light of everything going on in the world, and mostly with anxiety, depression, negativity. And so before we dive into the topic, I just want to introduce Dean. I'll introduce myself. Then we'll be talking about what is mindfulness, where you can apply it or how you can apply it in your daily life. And we're also going to be talking about what that would look like for you if you were to be able to go ahead and start today doing that. And then at the end, we'll open it up for questions. You can either drop them in the chat. So if you have questions as we go along, please just drop them in the chat, and then I can unmute you, or you can raise your hand if you want to talk and have a live discussion versus just putting it into the chat. So I'm going to pull up this wonderful bio that Dean sent me. When Dean and I will say when we first met, it was just like really amazing to meet somebody who's been on his path for as long as Dean has. And the minute you meet him, you can tell that he is a very deep thinker and someone who really takes his purpose here in life seriously. I asked him to send me a little bio, which he graciously did. And I'm going to read that bio to you. Dean said, "My first introduction to spiritual awareness was in my late teens. I experienced an understanding that was greater than anything I could imagine and beyond explanation. The invitation to consciousness through nature and animals. By my mid-20s, I had become an Orthodox monk, living and practicing in the California desert and a monastery in New Mexico. It was during this time I experienced events that led to communication with spirits. My practice taught me what it is to truly understand what being present meant, and gave me the ability to connect with the miracle grace of presence. I spent my days in deep meditation, learning not to identify with my ego self, and I dedicated myself as a disciple to my teacher. Over the years, there have been periods of detachment, consciously stepping back into my ego sense of existence, experiencing trauma and turbulence, again, only to be pulled back into my true practice. This was the beginning of self-realization, and I finally stopped resisting the divine invitation to become awakened." Very beautiful. And so Dean will probably answer more questions about himself if you have those. For myself, some of you, I think most of you know me from my Modern Intuition class group, Facebook group. And, but for those of you who don't, I've been on my spiritual path for probably about just as long as Dean, interestingly, or coincidentally or not. And for me, it started with a very blank slate of not growing up with any type of religion at all, and seeking to find peace in my head. And I was suffering from depression, growing up in an alcoholic home. And I, along the way, found hypnotherapy, and through hypnotherapy found that our thoughts, our thinking, our stories, our narratives are what drive how we feel. And it, over time, doing day in, day out, taking people into hypnotic trance, I began to experience changes in how I experienced my thoughts, how I experienced life. And then I would say the next influence for me was Eckhart Tolle, talking about the pain body and talking about the fact that we are not our thoughts. And so my sense or definition of mindfulness, I would say, is this daily ability, moment to moment ability, to become aware that I'm not my thoughts, and that my thoughts can cause me pain, my thoughts can cause me pleasure, but it's a real true sense of power when you can be aware that you have this ability to step back from them and choose them more consciously than just letting them run unconsciously in your life. So I'll hand it over to Dean and ask Dean to give you his definition of mindfulness.
Hello, everyone. Mindfulness is the concept of it, or the understanding of it, is rooted in many traditions: Buddhism, Hinduism, Sufism, early Christianity, which was where I initially was exposed to a mindfulness practice. And during my monk days, where pretty much the day revolved around prayer, lots of contemplation and meditation, and all with the understanding that the purpose of the wasn't really ever a goal to become mindful and become aware. It was really a discovery of, once you are not identifying with any of your thoughts, is when you find yourself in this eternal space of grace, and or God, or however you want to put it. And that was that happened to me in my early 20s, and my teacher introduced me to that practice. And but it's mindfulness is really simply about controlling thoughts, or slowing down your thoughts, all the chatter, all of the chatter, all of the thoughts, the identification with thoughts that become emotions that we start feeling or identifying with, which create all the issues that we have as human beings, with depression, anxiety, sadness, just trauma, on and on. And I've eventually, I think, became, at that age, I was just sort of in and out of over-identifying with my physical form and my body, my human side, and walked out of that, and realized eventually that all this trauma and all these patterns that I was experiencing in life, these very unconscious patterns of self-identifying with things that were not real, thoughts, that I really started becoming unhappy and found myself depressed. And like Eckhart Tolle says, identifying with my pain body. So mindfulness is simply developing an awareness, and the awareness is being able to become a witness to your thoughts, and not identifying with your thoughts. So then your mind and your thinking becomes very spacious, and you're able to see or understand the space between thoughts. So, and in that awareness, when the identification of thoughts begins to slow down, that's the mindfulness practice. Mindfulness is just simply awareness. And in that awareness is when we stop attaching to the things that create a lot of our unhappiness, truly. You know, we're always grabbing onto things in this world that feel like make us happy, but they're usually always material in nature, which means they sort of bring us temporary happiness. Thoughts, and in the practice of mindfulness, we learn that thoughts and how we identify with those thoughts and those emotions are simply very fleeting moments in time. They're not eternal. And what mindfulness through awareness eventually brings us, or what the discovery in that practice is, the understanding of what your true self is, the side of you that doesn't attach to any sort of thought or concept or idea. That's my quick run through. I think maybe sometimes it sounds sort of complex, but it really isn't, to me anyway. But there are, one of the things that we want to touch on is, you know, how does one start a mindfulness practice? And, you know, how can we stop slowing down the mind, slowing down the thoughts, and stop attaching ourselves to things that are fleeting. And this fleeting things that we attach to, whether it's a relationship or a car or anything like that, all comes from a thought. And in that itself lies the root and the core of unconsciousness, which is unhappiness, anxiety, sadness, things that are caused, that are things that aren't really real in nature because they're stemming from a simple thought. There are several lineages or traditions, Buddhism, Hinduism, and early non-dual Christianity that focuses very, this is sort of the process of eventually becoming enlightened, in essence, which is sort of the end goal. I think if you look at what humans are really, what our true potential is, you know, our potential really lies in the ability of becoming aware and becoming enlightened as a being. You know, we create many things and we design and we build and we have all this wonderful technology like the stuff we're using right now, but we're still not even our higher dimension, our higher self. And that's what mindfulness can bring in itself, is for us as human beings to truly reach a sense of a higher self or a higher frequency, or however you want to put it. But there's no, you can't describe it. It's not something that you can attach a meaning to, because it's something that no one has really experienced unless you've been enlightened already. And then you can kind of give some sort of understanding of that. And I don't know of anyone living right now that's actually an enlightened being that I know of. Doesn't mean there doesn't exist, but so anyway, I tend to get a little chatty myself, like you know, describing all this stuff just because it's something that I spend a great deal of time doing. Yeah.
Okay, well, yes, your passion for it definitely shows, Dean.
Did y'all hear that, by the way? Did y'all hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. The reason I asked is because my Bluetooth speaker just picked up the audio, so I need to bring it back to the computer. Bear
So,
with me 1 second.
okay, while you're doing that, so I put 3 bullet points tonight. What is mindfulness? How can it make our lives better? And how to get started today? And, just going a little deeper into the most common problem I see for people that are coming to my practice, whether it's coaching or hypnotherapy, almost every single one of my in-depth clients where we're working through going through divorce, going through a breakup, dealing with anxiety, even a couple clients I'm working with for success in taking their business to the next level. It's all about our stories, our narratives. And one of the things I invite my clients to do is to, every time as you're going through your day, if you start to feel yourself suffering, so you're upset, you're sad, you're frustrated, you're angry, ask yourself, what is the story I'm telling right now about this situation that is causing me suffering? And for myself, when I do this, sometimes I joke with myself to sort of it's my way of stepping back from the story is the truth, so I'll joke with myself and say, how's that story working for you, Becca? And then I'll say, like, that story's not working for me. And so what I'll have my clients do, what I do in my head is, write down the story as you're telling it right now. And then you can do it right in that moment or come back to it later. But what you want to get good at is, in my mind, is looking at what are the beliefs embedded in that story that are causing me stress. So yes, you can step back from it mindfully in that moment and detach and become aware that that's the story and you're going to step back from it. But for me too, if I want to get to a place where I don't keep looping those stories, I'm looking at, can I tell a different story that would make me, feel better? Can I step back from that story and say, hey, it's just a narrative? And I also encourage people to look at what are the beliefs embedded in that story, the negative beliefs, the limiting beliefs, the beliefs that are causing me to continue to create pain and suffering for myself, negative emotions, and then what's the new belief? And then that would be the point where with my clients, then we're using something like hypnosis to upgrade the software. But if you guys have any questions about that, we can talk about that later. But that's basically one of the strategies that I use and I teach. Dean, do you have any recommendations for people, like what they could do just starting out tonight or today to step into some mindfulness that might help them to feel better?
Yes, that process really revolves around the mind at the end of the day. Everything does. How we relate to the entire world that we're around is what the mind is telling us how to see it, because we all have what's called a conditioned mind. And in that conditioned mind are where all the narratives come from that start forming at a very young age through how we cope with certain experiences, the way we learn, our own, responses as we get older. And that's when we start developing these patterns in our way of thinking, and then also which manifests into our behavior, emotions, and whatnot. And a lot of that is formed through traumatic experiences starting at a very young age. But I also believe that it comes from past lives as well that can be carried over. Yeah. And but that's a whole nother subject. So the first thing in the process, I think, to get to a place where I use the word process very loosely, or even practice for that matter, but getting to a place where you're simply becoming aware of the fact that, you know, there's all these thoughts that we're constantly juggling and identifying ourselves as being, you know, for instance, you know, we're in our society, we're so driven by how we look, right? By having a certain body type, or, you know, wearing certain clothes, or making a certain amount of money, or, you know, having your house, and all these things that we are taught in our society from a very young age to start identifying with, even how we're supposed to be in a relationship with someone, more or less ourselves. And a lot of that is formed through many things. You know, in society, religion plays a large part of that. Even if if we're not raised in a religious family, it's still very much influenced, especially in the West, in Western society. And it's a very sort of dualistic nature of myself, and then, you know, God is over here, or this status, or you know, being accepted, and, you know, all these things that are simply the conditioned mind and thoughts of how we're supposed to identify with certain things. So to kind of unpack that a little bit, I always direct people into meditation and certain mantras that I think just simply begin to open the person up to, you know, tasting and smelling that perfume of being present. And that's really kind of what we're talking about as well, is the idea of what presence is. And that's the true discovery through mindfulness and awareness, is that the true identification of who you really are, where true happiness stems from, is when we learn to be completely present and not identifying with anything. And there's obviously the physiological benefits of meditation. I'm sure most of you here have experienced that a lot. And a lot of what I hear, what people tell me when they're meditating is, oh, my mind is so cluttered, you know, it's like I have all this chatter and all these things going on in my mind, and people get frustrated because they think just because they're going to sit there and go, you know, and, you know, all of a sudden their mind is going to become clear and they're going to have some sort of awakening or whatever. But I think what most people realize too is that, and unfortunately why a lot of people leave meditation, is because they don't get some sort of instant result. And that again is part of how we identify how things should be based on our conditioned mind, because we're so used to quick fixes and, you know, that kind of thing. And the same carries over because of our mind. But meditation is something that you should have no expectations of any outcome or any desires or anything that you identify. It's just simply being. And it's totally normal and okay for your brain to be completely full of all these racing thoughts that might be frustrating you. The thing you don't want to do is resist those thoughts. You want them to come in and flow through, but you just want them to keep kind of going past you. That's kind of like the very sort of beginning understanding of meditation and developing a mindfulness practice. And the more you do that, the more stillness you will discover, and therefore deepening the spaciousness of the mindfulness practice, in essence. So that's the sort of entry level way of entering meditation and mindfulness practices. Don't make it a goal. Don't make it something that you feel like you have to do every day. You just want to go into it naturally and easily and gracefully, and just let's let it happen. And I think there is the practice element of it is doing it as consistently as you can. But it's really important too not to attach an expectation. You know, it's like we're so used to, oh my God, I didn't work out today. I feel so out of shape. or that sort of crazy identification that the mind is just going nuts because of how you identify yourself as achieving something or setting a goal. But all that is doing is actually making you really unhappy. It's, you might get to your goal eventually, but then it's not going to last forever. It may not last very long at all. And then you're just going to be right back where you were. Mm-hmm. So the mindfulness takes you out of that mindset, the practice. And meditation is just a really good way because it's just about being still and being quiet. And I usually will recommend certain mantras that are really good for guiding the person away from identifying with what isn't real. So yeah, that's.
Yeah, thanks. The thing that really strikes me about what you said is that, and I like just sharing different ways to talk about the same thing so that it may hit one person or another and register. And how I look at it is when we have these agendas or things that we have to achieve, to me, that's a stereotypical way that we sometimes describe that is, there's the doing and the being, and there's the achieving and the being. Some people will call that like the masculine and the feminine. And, but there is a huge shift that happens for people when they can find more times in their day to be in their being, or to do something where there's not like an end goal. So some of the examples I give is like, you can go out with your kids and shoot basketball and keep score, or you can just go out and shoot hoops and not keep score. You can go for a walk and count your miles and count your steps and count your minutes. And there's some sense of like, I've got to achieve this. And then there's just going out and walking in nature and really listening to the birds and just immersing yourself in all your senses. And then what happens for people is, if they're so almost addicted to this doing and achieving, then if something happens and you get sick, where you can't be at your job, or physically you can't be at the gym or things like that, people can really have a hard time with that. And even in the roles that we play, when we step back from those roles. I remember years ago, I got diagnosed with chronic fatigue, and I really couldn't take care of my kids. I couldn't cook. And I couldn't do most of the things that I identified with, being a hypnotherapist, being a mother, being a wife. And it put me into this really existential crisis, but it was probably one of the best things that could ever happen to me, because it forced me to know who I was beyond what I do and how I show up, and the roles that I play. So that's how I relate to what you said, Dean, is just really learning to, for me, having that balance. When I'm at work, I am in my doing, I am in my serving. And then when I leave, I always try to do something where there's no agenda involved. So that could be, again, walking in nature, or walking out at the beach, listening to music. It could even be just singing in my kitchen. It's just doesn't have to be, the whole point is that it's just you being in your being and not so much in your doing. So yeah, so I was just going to drop down here Susie, who is with us. Susie deals with, I think, chronic pain. I met Susie on a retreat that I hosted for breast cancer survivors, and she's asking, I'll let you answer this first, Dean, can mindfulness assist with physical pain as well? Or do you want to add to that? Hold on, Susie, I'm going to unmute you. Okay, wait. Hold on. It's not unmuting. Okay, there you go.
So I'm mentally, I'm doing pretty great, but physically, I'm in a lot of pain. So I was thinking that clearing and opening up might work in the same way to get rid of the pain.
And Dean, do you have suggestions for incorporating some type of mindfulness that would help with that?
Yeah, this story, it kind of reminds, very much reminds me of an enlightened being in the late 1800s, early 1900s in India, a man named Ramana Maharishi, who towards the end of his life was in excruciating pain. But he had reached such a state of, he was truly an enlightened being. But I guess the point that I'm trying to make is, and he talks about this in some of his teachings, that when, even though the human form, the physical form is ailing, it is in pain, what a lot of times will accentuate that is the narrative that we're attaching to that experience. You know, pain, physical pain can very quickly become emotional because of what the mind is telling you. A lot of times when we're in pain, oh my God, I'm not going to be able to do this, or I can't do this, or, you know, a lot of negative things start manifesting in the mind that only perpetuate and manifest a much more strong emotional attachment to that. So even though I think through deep meditation and really connecting to the, I'm going to go off on a little bit of a more complex tangent, but feel free to ask me questions and I can unpack it. It's when you get to a point where you're connecting with your true I, your true essence, who you really are, your true self, that the pain that the physical form is experiencing becomes much less. It's not as much of a, the emotional and thinking attachment to that pain goes away. So I think you're able to live with the pain a lot easier. Now, this is just based on what some of my teachers experience or what I learned or whatever over the years. The physical response can, yes, at times, depending on what it is, can be excruciating, but through a mindfulness practice and we detach from that narrative that is creating that physical pain, or the emotional, the emotion that comes from the physical pain comes from the thoughts that we're attaching to in that element. And the attachment of thoughts happens in every part of our life, you know, in every little direction or thing that we experience as a human form, as a physical form, there's always going to be a thought to it, you know, because we are human beings. We have brains, we have these chemical electronic responses that are creating these thoughts. The difficult part of that is when we then have an emotion that's attached to that. And in the aspect of chronic pain or severe pain, it can definitely make it a lot worse. So my answer would be yes, through mindfulness and through a practice and through some proper guidance into that, you can definitely get a lot of freedom. You know, a lot of freedom from the anguish, from the emotional anguish, and from the constant mind chatter that's happening, always talking about the pain. You know, the mind is always thinking the pain, the pain, the pain, I'm in so much pain. Well, when you can pull out of that and be more, you know, develop that spaciousness from that narrative, then the pain may not seem quite as bad. And I know of gurus that who suffered horrible chronic disease, illness, who are in severe pain, who healed themselves through mindfulness. It's almost like when we take our brain out of what we're, you know, what we're attaching, when we stop attaching so much to the mind, And there's this separation of who you really are and your physical being, you know, the flesh that your true essence has taken form in. When we can exist away from that human narrative and all the thinking and all the attachments, that it's very possible for the body to actually heal itself, because the mind isn't perpetuating all that negativity and all that emotion that comes from really severe pain. So it's just like, and again, I'm going to get a little bit technical here. The ability to truly manifest and cure only can happen when you are truly connected to the true I, your true self, your true being. And that's where all the graces, the healing, you know, that's the eternal, that's your eternal self. That is what I call your God self, you know. So my approach to this, as I'm sure you'll pick up on pretty quickly, is I've always been a seeker. That's what led me down this road. I always felt a connection to a higher power, to a greater sense of consciousness, something that I couldn't describe. And that's something that's carried with me. And that is what I've discovered through the practice to be not something that I pray to that is over here and separate from me, but the fact that that in itself actually exists inside of me, you know, and that is what, that in itself is a mindfulness practice, to become aware. And the thing about the practice itself is you don't have to have beliefs, you know, you don't have to have any dogmas or any traditions. It can be it's very psychological in a lot of ways, because psychological is the human side, but that's how we start determining and being able to develop and sort of creating that separation of our true essence and then the psychological human side. And that's where a lot of the, where we manifest a lot of things in our life that we don't necessarily want to have, like illness or our pain body, tragedy, trauma, things like that.
Thank you.
Yeah. And for me, you know, what I'm sure you've probably looked into some of the books about, you know, our emotions, and it's like, and how they relate to pain or physical manifestations in the body, disease. And what it makes me think about is there's the pain itself, and then it's basically what he's saying is, or how I interpret it is, it's our story about it. And when I work with people, I think a better analogy to understand it is I work with people who have anxiety, and I'll work with people who have panic attacks. And my perception is we have the anxiety, which is the story. But then when people are actually experiencing the physical symptoms of anxiety, so when it's actually manifested in the body, the heart's racing, you might get clammy, you know, you feel like you want to run or fight. And then what happens for panic is people start to go, oh my gosh, I have this anxiety. This anxiety is bad. So they're telling a story about the anxiety, about the symptoms, and then they escalate. It can escalate to panic. And so I'll tell people, okay, if you don't want it to escalate to panic, when you have those anxious symptoms, if you can just be mindful with them, they're here, I'm aware of them, they're natural, they are a natural process that people go through. So that could de-escalate it. It's like, I'm having these symptoms, here they are. You know, could there be a mitigation in the pain if you were able to sit with it and not judge it, or be upset with it, be pissed off with it, or afraid? Like, again, I'll go back to when I had the chronic fatigue. There was the fatigue, and then there was my story about it. Like, oh my gosh, is it going to get worse? Is it ever going to go away? am I ever going to resolve this? And then I felt worse because not only did I have whatever I started with that day or in that moment, but then my narrative about it took me further into a bad place, you know?
Mhm.
So that's how I kind of look at it too, if that makes sense.
It does.
I can give an example. A really good friend of mine and ex-business partner from a previous business I owned some years ago developed out of nowhere, a perfectly healthy guy, really just a good-hearted, mellow guy, lived in Colombia. Literally overnight, developed such horrible chronic pain in his back that he ended up in a wheelchair and spent several years getting test after test after test to find out what was causing it, and not one doctor could diagnose what was causing his pain. So we were chatting, and I'm like, well, maybe this is some, childhood trauma, some manifestation, something that has manifested in your physical form from, early part of your life or something. So I turned him on to someone who was a teacher to me and a colleague and a very dear friend, and started doing business with him. And sure enough, that's what was determined, that there was, even though he was subconscious to it, he wasn't aware of it, but it was his pain, his debilitating pain, to the point where he literally was existing laying down, like he couldn't move. He was completely, he couldn't function. And it was horribly sad, but it took trying to get him to start the process of slowing down the mind and no longer identifying with the same narrative that was actually perpetuating some of that. The conditioned mind part that goes back to early childhood that he discovered was actually manifesting a lot of his pain, and eventually got better. So.
Yes, I wish this was all in my mind.
Yeah. Well, it's not. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, it wasn't in his mind either. It was, there's obviously different, everyone is different in how they develop their issue. But yeah, I think it's, you can't really think your way out of the pain. I mean, you can.
That's what my question was.
I don't know
Yes.
your specific situation. Yeah, I don't know your specific situation, but what was your next question?
I just wanted to ask you, does somebody else have a question? Or me?
I was going to ask if
No,
we've got a few minutes left. So I just want to see if anyone else had any questions. If you do, drop them in the chat and then I'll unmute you. But yeah, to me, it goes back to there's the suffering and then there's our story about the suffering. And so is there, for me, when I stopped, even, I've had issues with my son when he was growing up and he was diagnosed oppositional. And when I would put him to bed at night, I would start to worry, like, oh my gosh, what if he gets worse? What if he's torturing animals by the time he's 16 or robbing banks or whatever? So it was like what was going on that day, which wasn't good. And then there was the mind going into these stories about the potential it getting worse, things getting worse. And I know a lot of us do that. We ruminate on the past, we worry about the future. And so again, just being very mindful that you might just find immediate relief by not going into a story about the suffering,
Does anybody have any questions? Like, y'all obviously joined the group because you found it of interest. So, does anybody have anything they would like to discuss or talk about in relation to this?
All right.
Bueller.
Well,
Bueller.
well, thank you all for coming on
Thank
and
you.
joining us. And if you think of any questions later, I think most of you are in on Facebook, so you can reach out to Dean or I on Facebook. And thanks so much for
Thank
joining
you.
us. Have a good night.